Hey, this is Alex from GMAT Ninja. Welcome to video number 4 in our reading comp series. This one's on humanities passages. And when I say humanities, I mean music, art, literature, history, all that kind of stuff. Now, it's not uncommon for students, particularly people who've majored in some technical field like economics or engineering or science, to find humanities passages intimidating. And in a way, that's understandable. It's probably going to be on some topic that you haven't read about much in college, maybe something you've never even thought about, like the history of Renaissance harp music, or something equally obscure and boring. Now, the good news is, being familiar with the topic is totally useless. In fact, a lot of times it can just get in the way. I could think of a recent student who they wrote their college thesis on 19th century European painting, and then when they got a reading comp passage on just that topic, they really ran into trouble with the questions. The student, he couldn't stop importing all of his knowledge of the topic. He started confusing his own ideas, things he'd read about, with what was in the passage. So, if you play your cards right, an unfamiliar topic can actually be a blessing. But what about the issue of intimidation? Well, on an adaptive test like the GMAT, which if you're doing well, it should just get harder and harder, it's pretty much par for the course to get intimidated. So the question isn't, am I going to get intimidated at some point during the verbal section? It's, what do I do with that intimidation? Do I allow it to throw me off my game? Do I start skimming the passage instead of reading and trying to understand the meaning? Do I fall back on tricks like assuming that the first sentence of every paragraph is going to give me the purpose or the main idea? Or do I go the other route and start obsessing over every detail? Either way, what's happening there is intimidation is taking the reins. And if you notice that happening, you want to take the reins back, get back in control, and fall back on your good process. Read for the author's purpose, see if you can nail down the main idea, think big picture. Now, I had two students recently who ran into just this problem. They were both non-native English speakers, and every time we looked at a humanities passage, they had the same response, which was, I have no idea what's going on. And then when they got to the questions, they were really tense, they felt really confused, and things just kind of snowballed from there. So what we did was we went back to the passage and just asked a really simple question. Each paragraph, can you tell me, big picture, what's the author's purpose? Well, it turned out when we asked that question, they had a perfectly good understanding of the passage. They just were allowing kind of their intimidation of the language to get in the way. So once they realized that, they're in much better shape for the questions. When they went into the test, their verbal scores jumped 10 points, their overall GMAT scores jumped 100 points. They both got into their schools of choice, and all without learning a single thing about any humanities topic whatsoever. So today I picked two humanities passages, which I think will have some intimidation factor. We kind of go from easier to harder. So if you find the first one too easy, go ahead and skip to the second one. And the goal is, don't skim these passages, don't obsess over the details. Just think big picture, what's the author's purpose? And when you get to the end of each paragraph, I want you to come up with an 8 to 12 word summary of the author's purpose, and then we can go from there. All right, great. Let's take a look at the first passage. Okay, so what's going on in this first paragraph? Well, clearly the author is interested in this scholar, Antonia Castaneda. And what do we learn about Castaneda? Well, she's interested in 19th century literary portrayals of Mexican women and wants to examine that using women's studies and Mexican American history. Okay, So I'm expecting now, as I keep reading, to hear maybe more about Castaneda's scholarship, to hear more about these 19th century literary portrayals. Now, surprisingly, the next sentence actually doesn't really go in that direction. What I get is just sort of a general observation about how male authors at that time tended to define women in terms of their domestic roles. Okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure how that relates to this idea of 19th century literary portrayals, so I guess maybe it's just giving context. So I'm not going to obsess over that detail. I'll just keep reading. Hispanic law in territorial California protected the economic position of Californianas. Okay, who are Californianas? So you'll hit terms that you don't know with some frequency in these passages, but that's okay. There's no previous knowledge required. It's always going to be defined. So here we get a definition. Californianas are Mexican women of the territory. Okay, that makes sense. Mexican women living in California territory. So this law protected the economic position of these Californianas by ensuring them property rights and inheritance rights equal to those of males. Okay, so again, I'm not sure how this relates directly to 19th century literary portrayals of Mexican women. Um, but if I think about it for a sec, well, the author wants to relate Mexican American history to these literary portrayals, and this is a bit of Mexican American history, this 19th century law that protects property rights of Mexican women. Okay, so I could see how that might be tied to literary portrayals. Of course, this paragraph doesn't do that. So, taking a step back, how do I link all these together? So on the one hand, I want to be aware of the details, but I also just want to be thinking big picture. Um, and so what I'm getting from this is just that the author is really just presenting a scholar, Antonia Castaneda, who examines 19th century literary portrayals of Mexican women. Okay, and then specifically, Castaneda does this using Mexican American history and women's studies. Now, interestingly, I'm not really given any examples of this scholarship. Um, I was sort of expecting to, but I didn't get that. That's okay. Um, Now, as an active reader going into the next paragraph, I'm sort of thinking, so this law seems like it could relate somehow. It wasn't related in this paragraph to literary portrayals, but I'm guessing maybe that's where the author's going next. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but I'm just sort of anticipating what might come next. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the second paragraph. Okay, so what's going on in this second paragraph? Well, we noted that at the end of the last paragraph, we heard some details about a law that ensured the property rights of elite Californianas. So, what happens next? Well, in fact, the next paragraph picks up with that. For Castaneda, the law explains a stereotypical plot. Okay, interesting. So, we already knew that Castaneda was interested in how Mexican American history affects 19th century literary portrayals of Mexican women, but we didn't get that connection in the first paragraph, which is what I was expecting, but that's okay. I'll just keep reading. Um, and in fact, that's exactly where this next paragraph goes. So this law about elite Californianas explains a stereotypical plot that sounds like something literary. I'll just keep reading. So the stereotypical plot was created primarily by male non-Hispanic novelists, and it tells the story of an ambitious non-Hispanic merchant or trader desirous of marrying an elite Californiana. Okay, so this sentence, because I'm alert to the author's purpose in the first paragraph, I understand the importance of the sentence. It kind of starts to tie things all together. And because of that, I'm going to stop and reflect a bit on its meaning. So why would this law explain the stereotypical plot? Well, the law said that these Californianas would inherit property. It ensured their rights of inheriting property, and that in theory could make them wealthy if they're inheriting a lot of things, and that could make them attractive to a ambitious merchant or trader who wants to get rich. Okay, so now I can see how here's a piece of Mexican American history, this law, and it's related to a 19th century literary portrayal of a Mexican woman, specifically a Californiana. Okay, so I'm feeling good. I have a good sense of where the author is going in this passage here, but I'll keep reading. Maybe I'll get some more details. So the next sentence tells us that this is a noteworthy fact about these literary portrayals because, in general, Mexicans were portrayed unfavorably because of the Mexican American War. However, these Californianas, because they had this real life importance, because they were inheriting all this property, they were portrayed favorably. So that's some kind of contradiction there. Okay, so those are interesting things. I want to be aware of them, but again, I don't want to get lost in all those details. I want to keep my eye on the big picture. So, what's the author's overall purpose in that second paragraph? Well, the first paragraph was to tell us about Castaneda, who's interested in relating Mexican American history and women's studies to these 19th century literary portrayals. Paragraph 2 is to actually give an example of that. So, that's how I'm going to articulate the purpose here. Give an example of of a piece of Mexican American history. So this law about Californianas, uh, and this piece of Mexican American history explains a stereotypical literary plot. The plot about the non-Hispanic merchant wanting to marry an elite Californiana. And just as a side note, I'll say that this was notable because it was a positive portrayal. Whereas in general, the portrayals of Mexican Americans tended to be negative because of the Mexican American War. Okay, so I'm feeling like I have a handle on the author's purpose in each of those paragraphs. I see pretty clearly how paragraph 2 relates to paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 set out the general interest of this scholar, but didn't give us too many details or examples of the scholar's work. Paragraph 2, okay, we get a really specific example of the author of the scholar's main interest, relating Mexican American history to 19th century literary portrayals. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good to look at the questions. So let's take a look at question number 1. Okay, so let's take a look at question number 1. The apparent contradiction mentioned in line 29 refers to the discrepancy between the Okay, well, I remember this apparent contradiction, in fact, because we were talking about how, well, we have these positive portrayals of Californianas because they had this real life importance because they inherited property. So they were portrayed positively, whereas Mexicans in general had unflattering, unfavorable portrayals. Why? Because of the Mexican American War. So there's some kind of contradiction there. right? And notice that's pretty tied up with the author's main purpose. So I was already kind of focused on that. This definitely rings a bell. So let's take a look at these answers to see which one um, is talking about this apparent contradiction. The discrepancy between A, legal status of Mexican women in territorial California and their status in the United States. Um, well, no, the contradiction is between portrayals of Mexicans in general and these Californianas, so that doesn't do the trick. B, unflattering depictions of Mexicans in novels and the actual public sentiment about the Mexican-American War. Um, well, I think that we said that Mexicans were portrayed in an unflattering way because of the Mexican War. Um, and so there's not a contrast between their negative portrayal in novels and the actual public sentiment. In fact, those two things went together. There was negative public sentiment because of the war that led to unflattering depictions. Okay, and anyway, it doesn't get at the issue of Californianas, which is what we're interested in. So B is definitely out. C. Existence of many marriages between Californianas and non-Hispanic merchants, and the strictures against them expressed in novels. Okay, so again, that's just not the contradiction we're looking for. Existence of many marriages between Californias and non-Hispanic merchants. Well, that's what the stereotypical plot was about. Um, but that's not the contradiction that we're interested in. And were there strictures against these marriages in novels? I don't remember reading that anywhere. So for a lot of reasons, C is definitely not right. D. Literary depiction of elite Californianas and the literary depiction of other Mexican individuals. Okay, so that's the contradiction we're looking for. On the one hand, you have the elite Californianas who have a positive portrayal, Mexicans in general, negative portrayal because of the Mexican-American War. That's a apparent contradiction. So D is looking pretty good, but let's examine E just to make sure. Novelistic portrayals of elite Californianas' privileged lives and the actual circumstances of those lives. Okay, so again, yeah, I think the stereotypical plot is about these elite Californianas, but we never hear about some contrast between their actual lives and those portrayals. I don't think we ever hear any, real concrete details about their actual lives. Okay, so D was exactly what we're looking for. All right, let's take a look at the second question. Okay, let's take a look at question number 2. Which of the following could best serve as an example of the kind of fictional plot discussed by Antonia Castaneda? Okay, so just by considering my purpose statements, I know, okay, that fictional plot is discussed during the second paragraph. Um, I know roughly what it's about, but I'm just going to go ahead and refresh my memory of the details of this plot. Okay, the law explains a stereotypical plot created primarily by non-male Hispanic novelists. Okay, so here's the plot. The story of an ambitious, non-Hispanic merchant or trader desirous of marrying an elite Californiana. Okay, so, with that in mind, let's take a look. Which of the following could best serve as an example of the kind of fictional plot discussed by Antonio Castaneda? Okay, A. A land speculator of English ancestry weds the daughter of a Mexican vineyard owner after the speculator has migrated to California to seek his fortune. Okay, so let's see if that checks our boxes. A land speculator of English ancestry. Okay, so that sounds like a non-Hispanic merchant or trader. I guess land speculator, merchant or trader. That seems close enough, and English ancestry says it's non-Hispanic. Okay. Weds the daughter of a Mexican vineyard owner. Okay, so that could be an elite Californiana. Mexican vineyard owner sounds elite. This is that vineyard owner's daughter. Okay, after the land speculator has migrated to California to seek his fortune. Aha, so this is California. So this is we're dealing with a Californiana here, potentially. And he's going there to seek his fortune, so he's an ambitious person. Okay, so that checks pretty much every box. Um, A seems pretty good, but let's make sure that we can comfortably eliminate all the others, that we didn't somehow miss something. Okay, B. A Californian woman of Hispanic ancestry finds that her agricultural livelihood is threatened when her husband is forced to seek work in a textile mill. Okay, so this stereotypical plot is about people getting married. This California woman is already married, so I can just right off the bat say that's not what we're looking for. C. A Mexican rancher who loses his land as a result of the Mexican American War migrates to the northern United States and marries an immigrant school teacher. Okay, they lost me at Mexican rancher because I'm looking for a non Hispanic merchant. So that doesn't sound right at all. On top of that, he's marrying a immigrant school teacher, not an elite Californiana, so just wrong in every way. Okay, D. A wealthy Californiana whose father has bequeathed her all his property contends with avaricious relatives for her inheritance. Okay, so now if I was, let's say, skimming this passage, if I found it kind of intimidating and didn't really dig into the meaning, well, D does a really good job of word matching, right? Wealthy Californianas, property rights, inheritance, all those things are mentioned in the passage, right? And if I compare it to A, well, not so much, right? But if I look at the meaning, okay, although D matches the words, the meaning is totally off. Okay, it mentions a wealthy Californiana, but it's not about a non Hispanic merchant who's trying to marry her. It doesn't even mention that. Okay, so I'm not going to fall for D. E. A poor married couple emigrate from French Canada and gradually become wealthy as merchants in territorial California. Okay, well, wrong in so many ways, but at the very least, it starts with a married couple. The plot is about uh, someone seeking a wife, someone seeking marriage. Okay, so we can comfortably pick A. All right, let's take a look at the next question. All right. Which of the following, if true, would provide the most support for Castaneda's explanation of the stereotypical plot mentioned in lines 18 and 19? Okay, so just from my reading of the author's purpose, I know exactly what the stereotypical plot is. We reviewed it in the last question, so this is the non-Hispanic merchant who's ambitious and wants to marry an elite Californiana. Okay, so we're looking for the most support for Castaneda's explanation. Okay, so again, looking at our purposes again, Castaneda is all about explaining literary portrayals of Mexican women using Mexican American history. So what's Castaneda's explanation for this particular stereotypical plot? Well, there's this law that guarantees Californianas equal inheritance rights and property rights, and that made them, according to Castaneda, attractive as marriage material for non Hispanic merchants. Okay, so the explanation for the plot is this law. So we want to find something that will support the idea that this law does, in fact, explain this stereotypical plot. Okay, so let's see which of these answer choices does a good job of that. And, again, I'm not really sure exactly how we can strengthen this, so I'm going to keep an open mind and see, which of these things here provides the support we're looking for. Okay, A. Non-Hispanic traders found business more profitable in California while it was a territory than when it became a state. Okay, so how might this be relevant? Non-Hispanic traders. Okay, so non-Hispanic merchants or traders are part of the stereotypical plot. So the fact that they found business more profitable in California when it was a territory than when it was a state, does that support the idea that the law explains the stereotypical plot? Um, well, I'm not sure this idea of California being more profitable as a territory than a state. I don't remember that being addressed in the passage. So I'm not sure that I can draw any conclusions about that. It's hard to see how that directly relates to this idea of a stereotypical plot, aside from the fact that it mentions this non-Hispanic trader, but I don't see how it's linked at all to this idea of a marriage story. Okay, how about B? Very few marriages between Hispanic women and non-Hispanic men in 19th century territorial California have actually been documented. Well, the idea was that the stereotypical plot is based on some real life events where these non-Hispanic traders were interested in marrying these Californianas. And if there were very few such marriages, if anything, that weakens the idea because, well, I guess these marriages weren't happening. So how could they be an explanation for this plot? Okay, so B is actually the exact opposite of what we want. How about C? Records from the 19th century indicate that some large and valuable properties were owned by elite Californianas in their own right. Okay, so how might this be relevant and could it strengthen the idea that the law explains the plot? Um, well, it tells us that there was not only this law that ensured elite Californianas property rights, but that they did, in fact, own large and valuable properties. So that confirms that, okay, this law was in fact having a real life effect, and there were elite Californianas who were wealthy in their own right. Okay, so it doesn't link directly to the idea of marriage, but it does provide some supporting evidence that, okay, not only did this law exist that Castaneda mentions, but the law did cause Californianas to become very wealthy in their own right. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to that. Um, it's related to the plot that we're interested in. It could support the idea that the law, that Castaneda's explanation is correct. So I'll hold on to C. How about D? Unmarried, non Hispanic women in the 19th century United States were sometimes able to control property in their own right. Okay, well, unmarried, non Hispanic women, the stereotypical plot is about Californianas, Hispanic women, so D is just not relevant. How about E? Most of the property in 19th century territorial California was controlled by Hispanic men. Well, again, the stereotypical plot and Castaneda's explanation for it is based on the idea that these women, these Mexican women, Californianas, were inheriting and owning all kinds of property, and that made them attractive in terms of marriage. So, if most of the property was owned by Hispanic men, well, I mean, it doesn't strengthen Castaneda's explanation. I suppose maybe it's a slight weakener, but definitely not what we're looking for. Okay, so C, it's not necessarily what I was expecting to see as something that would support Castaneda's explanation, but it's much better than everything else. And it relates to the idea that these Californianas did in fact become wealthy, so in theory they would be attractive as marriage partners. Okay, so we're left with C. All right, great. Let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question number 4. The primary purpose of the passage is to. Okay, so it's a good thing we've been keeping track of the author's purpose in each paragraph, so let's just review those before we dive into the answer choices. So the purpose of paragraph 1, to present the scholar Antonia Castaneda, who examines 19th century literary portrayals of Mexican women using Mexican American history and women's studies. Okay, and then second paragraph, well, to give a specific example of Mexican American history influencing 19th century portrayal of a Mexican American woman. And this is Castaneda's idea about how there's this law that leads to a stereotypical plot about marriage between a non Hispanic merchant and a Mexican American woman. Okay, so again, in a nutshell, presenting the scholar, and then to give an example of one of these scholars' ideas. Okay, let's take a look at the answer choices. A. Trace historical influences on the depiction of Mexican Americans in the 19th century. Okay, so let's take it piece by piece. Is this giving us the primary purpose? Trace historical influences. Okay, so I think as we talk about this law, that's sort of Mexican American history. Um, it goes on the historical influences on the depiction of Mexican Americans. Okay, so it's the influence of this law on the literary depiction of Mexican women. Okay, so that kind of matches up in the 19th century, so that's what we're talking about. So A isn't bad. I'm tempted to hold on to A, but there are a few things about it that bother me. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. Sometimes, a right answer doesn't always strike me as perfect. But it doesn't say literary portrayals of Mexican women. It says just depictions, so it's not specifying literary. And it also just says Mexican Americans, so it's not specifically saying Mexican women. So I'm, a little on the fence about A. Okay, let's look at B. Explain how research in history has been affected by scholarship in women's studies. No, I think it was history and women's studies are affecting literary portrayals, not history affecting women's studies. So it mentions some stuff from the passage, but it gets the relationships all wrong. C. Describe the historical origins of a literary stereotype. Okay, so this kind of feels pretty similar to A to me. Describe the historical origins. Okay, again, that's this law about property rights of elite Californianas. So to describe the historical origins of a literary stereotype. Okay, so the literary stereotype, what is that referring to? Well, that's this literary story about elite Californianas and how they were sought after in marriage by non Hispanic merchants because they inherited all this wealth. Okay, so if I read between the lines, historical origins, I know what that's referring to, literary stereotype, okay, that also matches up with the purpose of the passage. Okay, so I'll just keep reading, see what D has to offer. D. Discuss ways in which minority writers have sought to critique a dominant culture through their writing. Well, these were male non-Hispanic writers, so D just gets that wrong. Also, the things they were writing about were not critiquing a dominant culture. Okay, E. Evaluate both sides in a scholarly debate about a prominent literary stereotype. Okay, so again, if I'm tempted by words that match, there's some things here. Sure, literary stereotypes are mentioned, there's a scholar, but I don't get any debate. I just get Antonia Castaneda's point of view, so E doesn't capture that. Okay, so let's compare A to C. Which one does a better job? Trace historical influences is what A says. C says describe the historical origins. I'm not getting any big difference there. It's not the exact same words, but it's a similar meaning. Okay, so then what happens next in A? Historical influences on the depiction of Mexican Americans in the 19th century. Okay, so again, I still feel queasy about the fact that it doesn't say literary portrayals and it's not specifying women. C. Historical origins of a literary stereotype. Okay, so that adds literary, and it's clearly referring to this stereotypical story about Mexican women. Okay, so A and C, when you stack them up and you compare, which one does a better job of capturing everything that's mentioned in the passage? We've got to pick C. Okay, a close call, but when you examine the exact language, consider what's mentioned in the passage, it's got to be C. All right, great. So that's it for our first passage. Let's take a look at the second one. And again, let's do the same thing. Let's go paragraph by paragraph. And can you give me, after the first paragraph, an 8 to 12 word summary of the author's purpose? Okay, let's take a look. All right, what's going on in this first paragraph? Well, let's start at the beginning. It is an odd but indisputable fact. Okay, so the author's about to present a fact that they think is odd. So I'm curious to know, what is this fact and why does the author think it's odd? Okay, so let's keep going. It is an odd but indisputable fact that the 17th century English women, who are generally regarded as among the forerunners of modern feminism, are almost all identified with the royalist side and the conflict between royalists and parliamentarians known as the English Civil Wars. Okay, so I think I have a sense of what this fact is that the author's interested in. It's that the forerunners of modern feminism are identified with the royalist side. Okay, but why does the author think that's odd? Well, at this point, I have no idea, but I assume the author's going to have to explain that, so let's keep reading. So, next sentence. Since royalist ideology is often associated with the radical patriarchalism. Okay, radical patriarchalism. Right off the bat, I mean, I know I've heard that term before, but what does it mean in this context? Well, I know I don't need any previous knowledge, so the author's going to have to explain it, so I'm just going to keep reading. Since royalist ideology is often associated with the radical patriarchalism of 17th century political theorist Robert Filmer, a patriarchalism that equates family and kingdom and asserts the divinely ordained absolute power of the king and by analogy of the male head of the household. Okay, so I think I have a sense of what's going on in that sentence. Royalist ideology is associated with this radical patriarchalism, which says that the male head of the household essentially has absolute power. So I'm going to pause for a second and think about how do those two sentences relate. Um, the last sentence, my question was, why does the author think it's odd that the forerunners of modern feminism are identified with the royalist side? So does that next sentence give me an answer? I think actually it does, right? Because if royalist ideology is associated with these radical ideas that the radical patriarchalism, that the male head of the household has absolute power, well, that sounds like a pretty non feminist idea. So if the forerunners of feminism are associated with the royalist side, and the royalist side is associated with these non feminist ideas, that's pretty odd. Okay, so I have a good sense now of what's the author's overall purpose just by getting through those first two sentences, putting the pieces together. Now, I'll keep reading and see does anything else interesting get added. But really, the author is just giving some more context, some more historical details. We learn that some historians question whether the royalists really were that closely associated with patriarchalism, and in fact, maybe there wasn't that much difference between royalists and parliamentarians. But the author says, okay, well, sure, but even if that were true, you'd expect it's still odd that the feminists are all associated with the royalist side, right? Because if there's no difference between royalists and parliamentarians, why is it that they're all associated? All the feminists are associated with the royalist side. Okay, so having gone through that paragraph, kind of as I'm going thinking about what's the author trying to do, I've got a good sense of the purpose. So I think I can articulate that as what's the author's overall purpose? Well, to present an odd historical fact. So to present an odd fact. Okay, and what was this odd fact? Well, the forerunners of modern feminism were associated with the royalist side. Okay, and well, why was that odd? Well, we know because the royalist side is associated with non feminist ideas. So I'll just note that down too. Royalists are associated with non feminist ideas. Okay, cool. So I have a sense of overall what's the author's purpose in that first paragraph. Let's look at paragraph number 2. Okay, so what's going on in this second paragraph? Well, the first paragraph presented an odd historical fact. The second one, well, let's see where it starts. Catherine Gallagher argues that royalism engendered feminism because the ideology of absolute monarchy provided a transition to an ideology of the absolute self. Okay, well, how does that relate to what came before? Well, an odd historical fact was presented that a lot of these feminists were associated with the royalist side. It looks like here what we're getting is an explanation of that odd fact. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, is the author stepping in and giving their own explanation? It looks like this is Catherine Gallagher's idea. Catherine Gallagher's arguing a reason why the royalists actually led to feminists. Okay, so what's the reason? An ideology of absolute monarchy, okay, that's the royalists' ideas, provided a transition to an ideology of the absolute self. Okay, so somehow that transition to the idea of an absolute self supports feminism. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly how, but I'm going to keep reading and we'll see what we get. Okay, so next the author gives an example. Okay, so this must be an example of someone who is a feminist but also a royalist. Okay, Margaret Cavendish is the name. We keep reading. We learn that Cavendish saw herself as the center of her own subjective universe, if we go a little farther down in the paragraph, rather than a satellite orbiting a dominant male planet. Okay, so as we suspected, this is a writer with some feminist ideas. If we keep going, Cavendish repeatedly invoked the model of the absolute monarch. Okay, there's the royalist idea, a figure that became a metaphor for the self enclosed, autonomous nature of the individual person. Okay, so you have the idea of the monarch, which the royalists are into, and that leads to the idea of the autonomous person, and that leads then to feminism. Okay, so what's the author overall up to in this paragraph? Well, the first paragraph presented an odd fact. This one presents one scholar's explanation for that fact. The scholar being Catherine Gallagher. One scholar's explanation for the odd fact. Okay, so what is that odd fact? It's the one that we mentioned up there, that the royalists, um, that the early feminists were associated with royalism. The, pardon me, the feminists were associated with the royalists. Okay, and on top of presenting this explanation, Catherine Gallagher also gives an example of a feminist who is also a royalist, and that's Cavendish. Okay, so this is a dense passage. There's a lot going on. But by kind of focusing on the bigger picture and seeing what's the author really trying to get across, what's their main purpose, I feel pretty comfortable with what we have. First, we presented this odd fact that the forerunners of feminism were associated with the royalist side. Okay, then, not surprisingly, we get the author presents a scholar's explanation for the odd fact. Because the idea of the absolute monarch led to the idea of the absolute self, which led to feminism. Okay, and then we're given an example of someone who, a writer who was a feminist but also a royalist. Okay, great. So I think we've got the big picture on this passage. Let's take a look at the questions. Okay, question number one. The author of the passage refers to Robert Filmer primarily in order to. Okay, Robert Filmer, that rings a bell. I think he was mentioned in the first paragraph. I'm going to hunt around and see, remind myself why this person is mentioned. Okay, so there it is, Robert Filmer. Since royalist ideology is often associated with the radical patriarchalism of 17th century political theorist Robert Filmer. Okay, so this royalist ideology is associated with radical patriarchalism of this guy, Robert Filmer. Okay, and this patriarchalism, again, is defined as something that is a very non feminist idea, essentially. It says that the male head of the household has absolute power. Okay, so why was the author mentioning this? Well, I remember as we were reading it the first time, we said we wondered why this is an odd fact that the early feminists were royalists. Why is it odd? And then this sentence comes and explains it. Well, it's odd because the royalists are associated with radical patriarchalism, and the person responsible for that patriarchalism is Robert Filmer. Okay, so that gives me a sense of how Robert Filmer is playing a role in the author's overall purpose. Let's see if that helps with this question. Okay, the author of the passage refers to Robert Filmer primarily in order to A. Show that royalist ideology was somewhat more radical than most historians appear to realize. Okay, I think Robert Filmer, yeah, he was a radical patriarchalist. That's what we're told about him. But is he mentioned in order to show that it was more radical than people thought? Um, no, it seems like it was there in order to explain why it was an odd fact, right? We knew there's this odd fact that the feminists were associated with the royalist side. Robert Firmel's ideas explain why it's an odd fact, but it doesn't have anything to do with the royalists being more or less radical than people thought. I don't remember that being discussed. Okay, B. Qualify the claim that patriarchalism formed the basis of royalist ideology. Well, actually, Filmer's being mentioned to show the link between patriarchalism and the royalists. Um, it's not to somehow qualify it or to question it in any way. Okay, so not the not the primary purpose that Filmer is mentioned. Okay, C. Question the view that most early feminists were associated with the royalist faction. Well, this is the odd but indisputable fact. So the author thinks that this is a fact, that the early feminists were associated with the royalist side. So the author doesn't question that. That's not why Filmer's mentioned. Okay, D. Highlight an apparent tension between royalist ideology and the ideas of early feminists. Okay, that sounds like what we thought, right? We were worried, well, why is this an odd fact? Well, in fact, there's this tension, this sentence explains, between the feminists and the royalists, because the royalists were associated with the ideas of Robert Filmer, these non feminist ideas. Okay, so that makes sense. Filmer's mentioned to highlight this tension between feminists and royalist ideology. Let's just make sure that we can eliminate E. Argue that royalists held conflicting opinions on issues of family organization and women's political rights. Well, I'm not sure if they did or didn't, but Filmer is mentioned not to point out that there's any disagreement. It's just to explain royalist ideology and its links to patriarchalism. Why is it there? It's to explain the tension between that and feminist ideas. So we're comfortable with D. All right, great. Let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question number 2. The passage suggests which of the following about the 17th century English women mentioned in line 2. Okay, so these women mentioned in line 2, I remember from our purpose statements, these are the forerunners of modern feminism, and the author thinks it's an odd fact that these forerunners of feminism are associated with the royalist side in the conflict between the royalists and the parliamentarians. And why is that an odd fact? Well, because the royalists themselves are associated with non feminist patriarchal ideas, so it's strange that the feminists are more on the royalist side than the parliamentarian side. Okay, so I've just kind of refreshed my memory using my general understanding of the purpose, so let's go through the answer choices. Okay, the passage suggests which of the following about the 17th century English women mentioned in line 2. A. Their status as forerunners of modern feminism is not entirely justified. Um, I know that they're described as forerunners of modern feminism. That's a fact. So I think the author believes that. I don't remember that ever being questioned. So to say that it suggests that their status as feminists is not justified, or as the forerunners of feminism isn't justified, I don't remember that at all. Let's get rid of A. B. They did not openly challenge the radical patriarchalism of royalist Filmarian ideology. Okay, so I remember that radical patriarchalism was mentioned to explain why it's an odd fact. In other words, there's a tension between these forerunners of modern feminism, who have feminist ideas, and this radical patriarchalism. So, does the passage suggest that these women did not openly challenge the patriarchalism of Filmarian ideology? Well, actually, we hear about this writer Cavendish who was openly challenging all kinds of non feminist ideas. So, B just sounds it's contradicted by the passage, so let's get rid of it. Okay, C. Cavendish was the first among these women to criticize women's subordination in marriage and assert women's equality with men. So Cavendish, for sure, is mentioned as an example of one of these forerunners of modern feminism, um, but does it ever say that she was the first to do any of these things, the first to criticize women's subordination and all that? That would be a big leap. We can't say that. So there's something right about C. Cavendish is one of these women, but the fact that she was the first, we can't make that conclusion. Okay, how about D? Their views on family organization and women's political rights were diametrically opposed to those of both royalist and parliamentarian ideology. Okay, well, royalists were associated with patriarchalism, and for sure, the feminists were opposed to that. Um, but were they opposed to royalist ideology in general? And what about parliamentarian ideology? I don't even know what parliamentarian ideology is, so I can't say that they were opposed to it. So D, it just goes too far. It can't be supported. We can get rid of it. Okay, E. Historians would be less puzzled if more of them were identified with the parliamentarian side in the English Civil Wars. Okay, well, would historians be less puzzled if more of these feminists were associated with the parliamentarian side? Well, I think that makes sense because they're puzzled. In other words, the author thinks this is an odd fact because these early feminists or the forerunners of feminists were associated with the royalist side, and that's weird because the royalists have non feminist ideas. So if more of them were associated with the other side, with the parliamentarian side, that would be less weird. Okay, so E makes sense. Um, just thinking about the overall purpose, this odd fact is that the feminists are associated with the royalist side. It would be less odd if some of them were associated with the parliamentarian side. That's what E is saying. Okay, so E is correct. Let's take a look at the next question. All right, question number 3. Which of the following, if true, would most clearly undermine Gallagher's explanation of the link between royalism and feminism? Okay, so what was Gallagher's explanation of the link between royalism and feminism? Well, I remember that was addressed in the second paragraph, and Gallagher refers to this other example, which is Cavendish. Cavendish was a royalist writer, um, and so we explore Cavendish's ideas, and Cavendish says, okay, well, you have this royalist ideology of the absolute monarch, that leads to the idea of the absolute self, and that supports feminist ideas. Okay, so by examining Cavendish as an example, Gallagher explains here's how royalism is linked to feminism. Okay, so now that we've refreshed our memory, let's take a look at these answer choices. Which of the following, if true, would most clearly undermine Gallagher's explanation of the link between royalism and feminism? A. Because of their privileged backgrounds, royalist women were generally better educated than were their parliamentarian counterparts. Okay, so how might this be relevant? Uh, Gallagher's explanation was to give an example of a royalist woman, Cavendish, and to talk about how one ideology of absolute monarch led to absolute self, which supported feminism. Well, it's hard to see how this is at all relevant. The comparison between royalist women and parliamentarian women. I mean, I guess if royalist women were poorly educated, maybe that would slightly weaken Gallagher's ideas, because it's hard to imagine these royalist women having complex ideas. That's a bit of a leap anyway. But the fact that they're well educated, well, it's just hard to see how that's at all relevant. Maybe very mild strengthener. Okay, how about B? Filmer himself had read some of Cavendish's early writings and was highly critical of her ideas. Okay, so Filmer, we can recall, that's the radical patriarchalist, so he had all these non-feminist ideas. Okay, so would it undermine Gallagher's explanation if he'd read Cavendish's writings and was critical of her ideas? Well, Filmer was a non-feminist, so if he was critical of Cavendish, that would suggest that she was quite a feminist. And if anything, I guess that would support Gallagher's idea that, Cavendish is a good example of a feminist. Um, so again, maybe a mild strengthener, but for sure it doesn't undermine Gallagher's explanation. Okay, how about C? Cavendish's views were highly individual and were not shared by other royalist women who wrote early feminist works. Okay, so let's think about how that could be relevant. Gallagher's explanation relies on an example, Cavendish. Why is Cavendish mentioned? Well, we look at her ideas about how royalist ideology led to feminism, and then we extrapolate from that and say, okay, well, this Cavendish example explains in general this link between royalism and feminism. Okay, so what if Cavendish's views were highly individual and they were not shared by other royalist women? Well, all of a sudden, she's not such a good example anymore. Because her ideas are individual, they're not generally true of royalist women. Well, then Gallagher's explanation hinges on Cavendish being a good example. If Cavendish is not a good example of royalist women, if she just has really individual ideas, well, then Gallagher's explanation falls apart because it all hinges on this idea of Cavendish being representative. Okay, so yeah, I think C does undermine the explanation. The explanation relies on Cavendish. C calls Cavendish into question as a good example. Okay, how about D? The royalist and parliamentarian ideologies were largely in agreement on issues of family organization and women's political rights. Okay, so the similarity or difference between royalist and parliamentarian ideologies, how is that relevant to Gallagher's explanation? It's kind of hard to draw a connection there, right? Gallagher's explanation, it's about how royalist ideology is similar to feminism. It doesn't really reference parliamentarian ideology or whether there's any similarity or difference there. Okay, so just the fact that they were in agreement, royalists and parliamentarians, on some of these ideas, it's hard to see how that undermines Gallagher's explanation. So we'll get rid of D. Okay, E, the royalist side included a sizable minority faction that was opposed to the more radical tendencies of Filmerian patriarchalism. Okay, so again, let's think about how that's relevant to Gallagher's explanation. On the royalist side, you have some folks, this sizable minority, who are opposed to Filmerian radical patriarchal ideas. Okay, well, if that's the case, that suggests, well, there are some of these royalists who are opposed to patriarchalism, who are somewhat feminist. So that supports the idea that some of these royalist women are feminists. Um, so I guess maybe that's a sort of, again, a mild strengthener. But again, in no way does that undermine Gallagher's explanation. So we can comfortably get rid of E. Just remind ourselves of C. Yeah, Gallagher's explanation relies on Cavendish being a good example that's representative of other royalist women. And C says, well, if that were not the case, that argument would fall apart. Okay, great. Let's take a look at the next question. Okay, question number 4. The primary purpose of the passage is to. Okay, so let's just reflect on the primary purpose for a second before we dive into the answer choices. Okay, so, well, the purpose of the first paragraph was to present an odd historical fact. Okay, and what was this fact? Well, that the forerunners of modern feminism were associated with the royalist side, which had non-feminist ideas. Okay, that's the first paragraph. What does the second paragraph do? Well, it comes in and we get an explanation, according to a specific scholar, an explanation for that odd historical fact. Okay, so that gives us a sense of the overall purpose. Let's take a look at the answer choices. The primary purpose of the passage is to A. Trace the historical roots of a modern socio-political movement. Okay, well, I take it modern socio-political movement is modern feminism, and trace the historical roots. Okay, well, sure, we're discussing these forerunners of modern feminism, and we talk about a specific example of one of those people. Okay, so I think some of that is going on in this passage. Um, but my question isn't, is A discussed in the passage? It's rather, is A the primary purpose? Is the primary purpose to trace the historical roots of modern feminism? Well, just because we're discussing it doesn't mean that's the author's primary purpose. Really, we know the author's purpose is to present this odd fact and then talk about some explanations for it. So while A is discussed in the passage, it doesn't line up with the primary purpose of the author. Okay, how about B? Present one scholar's explanation for a puzzling historical phenomenon. Okay, so let's break this apart. Puzzling historical phenomena. I guess that's the odd historical fact that these the feminists, the forerunners of modern feminism, are associated with the royalist side. And then, is the author's purpose to present one scholar's explanation for that? Well, I guess the one scholar is Catherine Gallagher, and she does in fact present an explanation for this puzzling phenomenon. So does that line up with the author's overall purpose? Okay, well, someone might say, yeah, but Catherine Gallagher is only mentioned in the second paragraph, not in the first. And that's true, but if you think about how do the first and second relate to each other, the whole purpose of the first paragraph is to present this problem, and that's setting it up for the second paragraph where you get an explanation for this odd phenomena. And we are in fact getting one particular scholar's explanation for that phenomenon. So actually, if you think about bigger picture, what's the author trying to accomplish, B lines up pretty well. Okay, let's consider C. Contrast two interpretations of the ideological origins of a political conflict. Okay, it takes me a second to even think about how this could be relevant. Political conflict? Is that the royalists and parliamentarians? Uh, do we have any idea about the origins of that conflict? So it's just hard to see how C is even discussed in the passage, so we can get rid of it. D. Establish a link between the ideology of an influential political theorist and that of a notoriously eccentric writer. Okay, again, I'm struggling to see who they're talking about. I guess the influential political theorist could be Robert Filmer, the patriarchal writer, and the notoriously eccentric writer, I guess, could be Cavendish. But they were at odds with each other. That's why they're presented, is because they disagree. You have a feminist and a non-feminist. So the primary purpose is not to establish some link between those two. It's rather to talk about the tensions. Okay, so D is out. E. Call attention to some points of agreement between opposing sides in an ideological debate. Okay, so I guess the ideological debate is feminist versus non-feminist, but I don't remember points of agreement ever being discussed. It certainly wasn't the primary purpose. Okay, so after considering all the answers, we can decide B is correct. So that concludes our reading comp video on humanities passages. And I hope that going through those, you've seen that being familiar with the topics or having any specialized knowledge about humanities is actually totally useless. And in fact, all you really need to do is stay focused on the bigger picture, be aware of the facts but don't get sucked into them, and for every paragraph you read, just keep asking yourself, what's the author's overall purpose here? Alright, well thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.